They called him the Lion of the Pulpit. But behind every lion's roar, there's something it's trying to keep in the shadows. Charleston, South Carolina, in the summer of 1856, was a city draped in wealth and whispered secrets. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clicks of polished boots, carriages rolled past grand Antebellum mansions, and society ladies fluttered their fans beneath the haze of southern heat. Beneath it all simmered a tension, one masked by scripture, ceremony, and civility. At the center of it all stood Reverend Silas Abernathy. Tall, lean, with silver streaked hair and eyes like storm glass, Abernathy wasn't just the pastor of First Baptist. He was its cornerstone. His sermons shook the rafters and shook the souls of his congregation. Every Sunday, the sanctuary overflowed with men in waistcoats and women in silk gloves, trembling as his voice thundered against sin and spoke of fire, justice, and redemption. His fame extended far beyond the steeple. He dined with plantation elites, advised local magistrates, and even corresponded with senators and generals. The people called him holy. His enemies called him dangerous. And to those who had something to hide, he was terrifying. Because Reverend Abernathy didn't just preach. He knew. He seemed to carry a sixth sense about the failings of others. A glance from the pulpit, and you'd feel your guilt crack open under his stare. Men confessed sins they'd buried for years. Women wept openly in pews. And each week, more came, drawn not by comfort, but by the searing truth he delivered. But where did that truth come from? Some claimed he had visions, that he could see into people's hearts. Others said he paid servants and children for rumors and confessions. There were even whispers that he kept a private notebook, filled with secrets his congregation didn't know he had taken from them. Still, no one dared confront him. Because Reverend Abernathy held more than just a pulpit. He held the soul of Charleston. That's why, when he failed to appear for morning prayer on July 14, 1856, the entire city froze. At first, it was brushed off. Perhaps he was unwell, or traveling. But as the hours passed, anxiety turned to fear. The church doors remained locked, something unheard of. His horse and carriage sat untouched, and no one, not even his assistant pastor, had seen him for 2 days. Then came the whispers. The dockworkers claimed they saw a dark figure enter the church the night before. A maid nearby said she heard chanting in the early hours. One man, drunk on his porch, swore he saw flames inside the church windows, but they vanished before he could alert anyone. By sunset, the mayor himself ordered the doors broken open. What they found inside was not a crime scene, not yet, but something stranger. The sanctuary was empty. The pews were in perfect order. The pulpit stood as if untouched. But his Bible was open, pages fluttering as if by a breeze, even though the air was still. And then they noticed it. A trail of dark, dried blood near the altar. No body, no footprints. Just the word judged scrawled on a piece of parchment, placed neatly beneath the cross. The city recoiled. Within hours, prayer circles formed. Candles burned through the night. Some believed Abernathy had been taken by God, raptured like Elijah. Others believed something darker had happened, perhaps retribution from someone he had exposed. His disappearance was reported in newspapers as far north as New York. Rewards were offered. Church bells rang daily. But no answers came. Only silence. But for some, especially those who had sat in the front pew and felt his gaze pierce through them, the silence was the loudest part. Because if Reverend Silas Abernathy was gone, then who would speak for their sins? And more frightening still, what if someone wanted him gone because he knew too much? The church doors were locked, the candles were cold, and the preacher's voice, once thunder, was nowhere to be heard. July 14, 1856, began with stifling heat and a silence that blanketed Charleston like a shroud. The city stirred slowly, as it always did in the summer, creaking shutters, distant hooves on cobblestones, the hum of cicadas. But this day would not unfold like the rest. At First Baptist Church, nestled among weeping oaks and rose brick mansions, something was wrong. At 6 a.m., the church sexton, Henry Lowe, arrived to prepare for morning prayer. He was always the first inside. But this morning, the church doors were locked from within. That had never happened before. Henry knocked softly at first, then harder. He rattled the handle. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. The lamps inside were cold. And worst of all, Reverend Abernathy's carriage still sat beside the chapel, untied and untouched. By 7 a.m., a crowd had begun to form. Church staff, worried deacons, early congregants in linen coats, and barefoot children who wandered up to see what the fuss was about. Word spread quickly down Meeting Street. The mayor's wife sent her coachman. Local reporters arrived. By 8 o'clock, the crowd had doubled. Finally, at 8:14 a.m., a constable was summoned. When no key could be found, he gave the order. 2 young men broke a stained glass window near the office entrance and crawled through. What they found inside was not chaos. In fact, it was too still, too perfect. The sanctuary remained in pristine order. Every pew aligned, every candle snuffed, the altar cloth pressed smooth. Yet the air held a weight, a stillness that didn't feel holy. It felt like something had been waiting, watching. And then they saw it. The pulpit stood empty. The Bible opened to the book of Revelation, chapter 20. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. On the pulpit steps lay a trail of dried blood, dark and almost black in the morning light. It led from the base of the pulpit toward the altar, and stopped abruptly before the communion rail. There was no sign of Abernathy, no broken furniture, no sign of a struggle, only the blood and a strange burnt scent, like the ashes of old incense mixed with something fouler. Then one of the men noticed something under the Bible, a scrap of parchment, carefully placed, folded once. Written in a trembling hand were a single word and nothing more: judged. The constable cleared the building and began an immediate search. Every room in the church was checked. Abernathy's study, the vestry, the small chapel, even the cellar where wine and candles were kept. He was nowhere. Even stranger, the church had been locked from the inside, and all the keys were accounted for. No windows were broken, no back doors tampered with. It was as if the preacher had simply disappeared into smoke. Panic spread like fire. By noon, Charleston was in uproar. Rumors flooded taverns and tea parlors. Some believed Abernathy had been abducted, taken by a political enemy or one of the many sinners he had exposed. Others, more superstitious, believed he had been claimed by the devil himself, taken from the altar as punishment for daring to speak the truth too boldly. Still others whispered a more unsettling theory. He did it to himself. They recalled his final sermons, fiery, apocalyptic, obsessed with the wrath of God and the sins of Charleston's elite. He had warned that judgment was coming, that fire would purge the unclean, and that a shepherd must sometimes go into the flames to call the lost. The more people remembered, the less clear things became. The mayor offered a $5,000 reward for any information. Detectives from Savannah and Columbia were brought in. Blood samples were taken. The church cordoned off. But every lead turned to ash. There were no ransom letters, no witnesses, no motive, no body, just that one word left behind: judged. In the weeks that followed, First Baptist Church became a pilgrimage site. Some came to mourn. Others came to speculate. A few came to pray, but most left quickly, unnerved by the strange energy in the sanctuary. Because something had shifted. Something felt wrong. The pulpit was never used again. Services moved to the side chapel. People said the altar whispered during evening prayer. Children cried when they passed by it. Candles wouldn't stay lit near the rail. And so the silence continued. The man who once filled Charleston with thunderous sermons had vanished into silence, and in his absence, only fear remained. The walls of First Baptist Church were meant to hold prayers. Instead, they hid sins so dark they festered. After Reverend Silas Abernathy's disappearance, the city of Charleston drifted between grief and fear. The pulpit stood empty, the pews thinner each Sunday. No one had the courage or the audacity to replace the preacher whose voice once made grown men weep. But the church couldn't remain frozen forever. By autumn, the deacons of First Baptist agreed the sanctuary had to be renovated. Perhaps, they reasoned, a new coat of paint, polished floors, and restored stained glass could ease the unease that still clung to the chapel like mildew. What they uncovered instead would unravel the very soul of the congregation. It began innocently enough, workers tearing down water-damaged plaster behind the altar. As one of them chipped away at a section of crumbling brickwork, his hammer hit something hollow. The sound echoed oddly, not against wood or stone, but air. Behind the bricks, they found a sealed cavity, roughly the size of a closet, hidden directly behind the pulpit wall. The cavity was filled with the stench of rot and dust. Inside, beneath layers of soot and ash, were bones. Small bones, child-sized, charred and scattered across a stone slab. The remains lay jumbled, as if tossed carelessly. No burial, no ceremony. Just evidence, forgotten behind brick and verse. The workers fled the church. The renovations halted immediately. A doctor from Columbia was brought in to examine the bones, and his quiet conclusion chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. At least 3 distinct bodies, possibly more, likely aged between 6 and 12, burned, not buried. Charleston reeled. Who were these children? How long had they been there? How had no one noticed? And most importantly, why were they hidden inside the house of God? But that wasn't all they found. Inside the cavity, tucked beneath a cracked wooden panel, was a leather-bound ledger, water-stained and brittle with age. It bore no title, only a single embossed letter in gold, S. Inside the ledger were lists, rows upon rows of names, each paired with dates, sins confessed, and notes written in Abernathy's neat, angular handwriting. Some entries were mundane. Mrs. P. Envy of neighbor's child. Confessed. Wept. Advised prayer. But others were darker. C.D. beat his housemaid. No remorse. Warned of wrath. E.T. poisoned horse to punish wife. Denied confession. And beside many of the darkest sins, a red X was marked beside the entry. Over 100 names. Dozens with red marks. Among them were the names of judges, bankers, plantation owners, even 2 sitting members of the state legislature. The ledger didn't just record sin. It cataloged guilt and perhaps punishment. The discovery sent shockwaves through Charleston. The church immediately attempted to suppress the findings. The bones were quietly removed. The ledger was never turned over to the authorities. The deacons claimed it was evidence of a misunderstood confessional system and urged the congregation to focus on faith, not scandal. But the rumors could not be silenced. People remembered Abernathy's strange remarks about cleansing fire. They recalled the cryptic sermons, the sudden disappearances of certain congregants, the families who'd moved away without notice. Some began to connect dots they had tried to ignore for years. And then came the stories. People who claimed that Abernathy had visited them in the dead of night, asking questions only their confessor should have known. A few admitted to being threatened, told to leave town or else. Even more unsettling, several of the names in the ledger with red XS were people who had mysteriously died or vanished altogether. So was Abernathy a preacher or a punisher? Had he been exacting divine justice? Or had he grown drunk on power, becoming judge, jury, and executioner? No one could answer. But one thing was clear. Someone had discovered what Abernathy was doing, and they wanted it buried. Maybe that's why he disappeared. Maybe he was silenced before he could expose what he knew. Or maybe he sealed himself away, choosing to hide his crimes inside the very walls where he once shouted God's name. The church remained closed for 6 months. When it reopened, the pulpit remained untouched. A velvet rope was drawn around it, and a new minister was installed in a side chapel. They said it was a sign of respect, but everyone knew the truth. The walls had spoken, and what they said could never be unheard. Sometimes the dead don't speak, but the ones who survive carry their secrets like a sickness. 6 months had passed since the horrifying discovery behind the pulpit walls. First Baptist Church tried to move on. A new preacher had been quietly installed. The congregation shrank, but the faithful remained. Some said prayers. Others whispered prayers. Most avoided the topic altogether. But in December of that same year, a voice pierced the silence. Her name was Clara Bell Morton. She had been just a servant girl, barely 17, when she entered Reverend Abernathy's household as a housemaid. Now, nearly 10 years later, she walked into a Charleston courthouse, dressed plainly, her hands trembling, as she delivered a sealed letter to the magistrate. It bore one sentence: "I know what happened to Reverend Abernathy, and I can prove it." Clara Bell wasn't the kind of woman people listened to. Born to a washerwoman and a field hand, she had grown up on the edge of Charleston's respectable society. Quiet, invisible, unimportant. But that was exactly what made her dangerous. Because no one paid attention to a girl scrubbing floors or carrying coal buckets. No one hushed their voices around her. And over the years, Clara had heard and seen more than anyone suspected. In a private interview, she told the magistrate and 2 clergy officials a story that would shake Charleston's elite all over again. According to Clara, she had served Abernathy from 1847 to 1853. At first, she described him as kind and disciplined. But something changed after the death of his sister, a woman who had drowned mysteriously in a church baptismal pool during a private ritual. After that, Abernathy became obsessed with purity, punishment, and the idea of spiritual reckoning. Clara claimed he began keeping odd hours, locking himself in his study with ledgers and letters, burning documents late into the night. And then the visits began. Once a week, sometimes more, powerful men would come to the parsonage. Judges, landowners, even the mayor. They came alone after dark and left pale-faced and silent. Clara said she once peeked through the parlor door and saw Abernathy whispering fiercely to a magistrate with a Bible in one hand and a bloody handkerchief in the other. But it wasn't just secrets and meetings. Clara confessed something more intimate, something more terrifying. She said she and Abernathy had been lovers. It wasn't love, she clarified. It was control. He told her she was chosen, that he had seen her in a dream, that her voice would carry truths no man would dare speak. He spoke in riddles. He would read to her from Revelation and ask her what she feared most. He claimed she had a clean soul, and that the souls of others were rotting in the walls of Charleston. And sometimes he would scream at night, wake up shaking, muttering about the ones under the floor. He said they whispered to him through the wood, that their sins weren't forgiven, that his sermons weren't enough. He said Charleston was infected, and he was the cure. Then came the final night. Clara remembered it vividly, July 13th, 1856. She brought him tea before bed, but he didn't drink it. He sat at the parlor table, surrounded by ledgers, staring at a blank parchment. The candles flickered, though the windows were closed. He turned to her with sunken eyes and said, "They're coming for me. Not to kill me, to stop me from speaking." Clara asked who. He shook his head. "The ones I trusted. The ones I absolved. They fear the truth more than they fear damnation." He stood up, pressed something into her hand, a silver cross, and told her to leave the house immediately. She ran. That was the last time she saw him alive. For years, Clara kept a secret, out of fear, out of shame. But when the bones were discovered behind the church walls and whispers of justice returned to Charleston, she knew the truth had to surface. The magistrate took her testimony, but nothing came of it. The cross she presented vanished from a record. The names she listed, powerful ones, never appeared in print. Her statement was quietly buried. She was warned not to speak again. But rumors spread fast in Charleston, and Clara Bell became a symbol of a different kind of courage, not of martyrdom, like Abernathy, but of survival in a world that preferred silence to truth. She died in 1872, penniless but not forgotten. Her final words, spoken to a nurse, were recorded in the hospital ledger. They didn't kill him. They buried him standing up, so he could still preach. Some truths don't rise from the grave. They wait below it. By the end of the century, Reverend Silas Abernathy had become a ghost in Charleston's memory. His name no longer echoed from a pulpit. His sermons were quietly removed from the church library. First Baptist continued under new leadership, with new faces, new hymns, but the shadow of his disappearance never fully left. The congregation still avoided the front altar. The sanctuary, though beautifully restored, remained oddly cold. Candles near the pulpit sputtered without wind. Children refused to enter alone. And late-night caretakers sometimes heard what they swore were soft footsteps pacing behind the organ, or a voice reading scripture to an empty room. Then, on October 2nd, 1891, nature brought back what the city had buried. A ferocious autumn storm slammed into Charleston. Lightning tore through the sky, rain flooded the city's oldest quarters, and wind toppled trees that had stood for over 100 years. When the storm passed, First Baptist stood, but not untouched. The pulpit, still unused and roped off after 35 years, had cracked straight through the center. Beneath it, hidden beneath layers of old oak and limestone, workers found something no one knew existed. A trapdoor, flush with the floor, sealed shut with rusted iron, and an old leather strap that snapped at the first tug. The men hesitated. Even without opening it, the air that escaped from the crack was cold. Impossibly cold. When they finally pried it open, what they found was not a root cellar, but a passage, sloping downward, carved from stone and earth. The tunnel stretched 15 feet, ending in a narrow, arched chamber, no larger than a monk's cell. No one had stepped into it for decades, possibly longer. Inside, they found candles melted down to stumps, a mold-eaten prayer bench, and the remains of a large wooden chair, its arms worn smooth by hands long dead. A cracked bowl of oil sat in the corner, but the most disturbing detail was what covered the walls. They weren't bare stone. They were painted, covered in drawings, etched with charcoal, ash, and what might have been blood. Over a dozen illustrations circled the room. Each one showed the same figure, a man standing before a congregation of skeletons. The details were chilling. In every image, the man wore Abernathy's robes, his silver cross glinting in the darkness, surrounded by rows of grinning skulls in church pews. In one image, the man pointed toward the viewer, his eyes hollow. In another, he was kneeling, arms outstretched, as if offering himself to some unseen force. In the center of the chamber was a small podium, and on it lay one final journal, water-damaged, scorched at the edges, but still legible. Its pages were sparse, filled with brief entries, ramblings, and half-formed thoughts. But the last page was what froze the blood of the men who read it. It read, "They said I would burn for this. I welcome it, for judgment must begin in the house of God. The walls remember. The floor drinks the blood. My voice will not die. Confession does not erase the sin, only sacrifice." The final line was written in shaky ink, as if by a dying hand. I buried myself so I could watch what they become. The chamber was sealed again by city officials, quietly and without ceremony. The journal was reportedly taken to a historical archive, but has since disappeared from public record. No one can say where it is now. First Baptist never reopened its main sanctuary. A fire, blamed on faulty wiring, destroyed part of the roof the following year. Insurance refused to cover the damage, citing acts of God. The church was sold in 1903 and converted into a museum. But even today, the staff avoids the pulpit floor. Tour guides don't mention the hidden chamber. The hallway that once led there is now bricked over. The legend of Reverend Silas Abernathy lives on, whispered among the elderly, hidden in dusty family journals, and retold in hushed tones by those who claim to have seen a figure in the window on stormy nights. They say he's still watching, that the stone trapdoor never fully locked, that somewhere beneath Charleston, the preacher still waits in silence, surrounded by sins no prayer could cleanse. Because some sermons were never meant for the living, and some truths refused to stay buried.